Welcome to another installment of City Lights Live, the virtual component of the City Lights events calendar. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis. On Thursday, January the 30th, 2025, City Lights had the distinct pleasure of hosting Jathan Sadowski in celebration of his new book titled The Mechanic and the Luddite, A Ruthless Criticism of Technology and Capitalism. It is published by University of California Press, and it demystifies how the two systems of technology and capitalism work together and posits that it's not enough to know how the machinery of capitalism is organized and how its parts operate. We must also know whom the machines serve and when the time has come for them to be taken apart, to be rebuilt for new purposes, or eliminated for the greater good. The Mechanic and the Luddite equips readers with the practical tools and the political guidance needed to make these crucial decisions. It arrives to us at a moment where powerful technologies are not just reshaping and affecting human culture, but affecting every living species as well as the very planet itself. Jathan Sadowski is senior lecturer in the Faculty of Information Technology at Monash University. He is the author of the book Too Smart: How Digital Capitalism is Extracting Data, Controlling Our Lives, and Taking Over the World. He is also host of the podcast This Machine Kills, both of these on political economy of technology. He was joined this evening in conversation with Brian Merchant and Edward Ongweso Jr. Brian Merchant is a journalist and author who covers technology, labor, and culture. He is a reporter in residence at the AI Now Institute and has served as the technology columnist at the Los Angeles Times. Edward Ongweso Jr. is a Brooklyn-based writer and editor. He is the co-host of This Machine Kills and a senior researcher at Security Context. The conversation was held in the main room at City Lights Bookstore, to a house filled to capacity with activists, attorneys, tech entrepreneurs, academics, students, and the general public. We hope you enjoy it.
All right, great. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I mean, this is so unbelievable to see so many beautiful faces here in support of this book. Or maybe you just wandered in off the street and you saw a bunch of people and you're like, it's kind of warm in there. And that's happy. I'm happy to have you for that, too. But no, this is really exciting to be able to do a big proper book launch in San Francisco, the belly of the beast, and be joined by two of my near and dear friends. Arms, and many, many other people I see in the audience today who know the Luddites were right, as Wendy's shirt says right there. And so the way that we're going to run this then is I'm going to just read the first couple paragraphs from the book just to kind of set the scene. So just a couple minutes, indulge me for it. And then the three of us are going to basically do like a live mini TMK. We're just going to have a freewheeling conversation about things that are happening now, themes from the book, and wherever that might take us. And then, as we heard as well, there'll then be like 20, 30 minutes at the end of that for Q&A from the audience. So be thinking of your more of a comment than a question that you can give afterwards. All right, I'll get things kicked off. So the first chapter, Two Systems, starts, we are constantly being made to serve the needs of two systems, technology and capitalism. Their purposes and goals are almost always prioritized above all others. Their imperatives and logics very often have more influence than any others. These systems could also be called structures. They are structures in the sense that they force social life into specific forms, but also in the sense that we live inside. We are completely entombed by these social constructs. Neither exist outside humans, but both are treated as beyond humans. They are products of human values, choices, and actions, but they are also larger-than-life institutions that even the most powerful people claim to have no control over. At the same time, they deny anybody else the agency to exert control over them. In this way, technology and capitalism are more like religions and states. In a relatively short amount of time, just a few hundred years really, these modern systems have altered human society and the natural world at every scale. They are not totalizing in the way that destiny is inescapable or that God is omniscient. Rather, they are totalizing in a way that is more like a toxic miasma, an oppressive cloud emanating from everywhere, choking and trapping anything caught in its atmospheric existence, which is now essentially everything. Technology and capitalism work in tandem to create mutually reinforcing systems, which we must then work for, within, and against. We cannot understand one without seeing how it is connected to the other. They have fused together into a dual system, technological capitalism. And I'll leave that there because that really, I think it sets the scene for the book as a whole around trying to better understand these dynamics of technological capitalism, how these systems are created, what they mean for our lives, how they operate, but also, as we heard, how we should think about taking them apart, disassembling them.
Yeah, it's great. Great. It feels even better coming out of your, because I read it on the PDF a long time ago. I was very excited when I heard the title of the book and that this was coming out, and then I was equally as excited to read it. It's just such a great work. So congrats, Jathan. Let's give him a quick round of applause here. But I feel like to start, we got to define the terms. I think this is a very, like a book interview question. So we got the two. We got the mechanic and we got the Luddite. And I'm just going to push the glasses up on my nose here and say the Luddites were both mechanics and Luddites. That's interesting though. Maybe the last time or one of the last times, as David Noble and other historians have pointed out, that both of them were embodied in a position to register a critique like this. So I think before we get really rolling, I think it'd be useful for you to explain, this framework, the mechanic and the Luddite, and why you chose to approach the topic this way.
Yeah, so I think and you're exactly right. I mean, the Luddites were mechanics, right? Like, this is not an either-or situation. To me, these are two sides of the same coin, kind of two different elements of the models, the role models, or the archetypes that we should really be embodying in this materialist analysis of technology and capitalism. And I think that to me is where the ruthless criticism aspect is a very explicit in the book allusion to Marx, talking about a ruthless criticism of everything existing, right? That like everything should be held up for material analysis, for ruthless criticism, and we should not shirk from our findings or from the powers that be in that. And so for me, thinking about the mechanic and the Luddite, right, is also merging the technical material analysis with that socio kind of normative understanding or critique of what it is that technology does, how it operates, where it comes from, right? Like really shining the interrogative light, the big bright white light flashbulb on it, and asking it those hard questions that are seemingly really simple, but I think are not asked in serious ways, right? That like, what do you do? How do you do what you do? Who do you work for? These are the kinds of questions we should be asking of all technologies, not treating them as merely bits of vaporware that are just, ephemeral, immaterial hype that exist in, promises or dreams or visions of some venture capitalist or whatever, but as like really trying to figure out what's the real material thing there, right? And to me, that is the role of that mechanic, of really having not just the mechanical knowledge of how these technologies operate, what they do, but also acting on a mechanical curiosity that I think has largely been taken away from us, right? The ability to actually have a material understanding of the world. We've all been victimized by that kind of like de-skilling of not being able to have that mechanical knowledge, not feeling like it's okay to have the mechanical curiosity and then act on it, but instead just being fed marketing copy around what these things do, how they work, and we have, and it's, what I was saying in the reading there, these things are treated as beyond us, right, above us in that way. And really, to me, the mechanic, the Luddite, is about bringing it back down to earth and getting our hands dirty as we kind of poke around in the machinery.
Yeah. It's really, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's to the extent that we've gone and that we've sort of, ceded control and power over. It's to the point where there is needs to be a political movement, just to win back the right to repair your stuff. Right? There's a right to repair movement whose whole goal is just to ensure that you can fix the technologies and the stuff that you've bought already and that you own, which is, I think, just such a telling reflection and of what you're talking about here. And yeah, I love the ruthlessness in here and how you just go for broke, especially since my book about the Luddites was Blood in the Machine, a tepid criticism of no. I'm glad that you dialed it up a notch and just went all out here, because I think this is absolutely what's needed. It's still so piecemeal, even as as something of a tech critic myself. I feel like I'm, there's you look at one silo over here, or one problem over here, or one company doing the wrong thing, and what we really need to have in this, like in the background all the time, is this conversation about how technology is permeating everything, how technological capitalism is dictating. I think you put it, you're nodding to Winner, I think, when you talk about how technology in the modern world is like legislation now, but we don't have control over it. So could you talk a little bit more about that? I'd be curious to hear, like, now in this, like, just this week with, DeepSeek and like the commoditization of AI, like how you're looking at, the themes in this book as just being pressed up to, like, dialed up to 11 as it's coming out.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I was thinking about this book and kind of conceptualizing what kind of book I wanted to write as well, I didn't want to just do, I think a lot of ways of what my first book does, what a lot of books about technology and society do, which is, look at the latest and worst examples that are around and kind of give you some ready-made conclusions about, here's what you should think about bias and AI, right? Like, here's what you should think about this or that. It's kind of like packaging up the conclusions so that you can then read the book, walk away being like, okay, cool, now I know why bias is bad, and I can go and like tell people bias is bad, right? And I conceptualize those books as the kind of like give a person a fish book, right? You read the book and you walk away and you're like, cool, I've got a fish, and now I can talk about bias. And I wanted to write something that was more of a like teach a person how to fish book, though, right? I wanted to write a book that was getting more to the underlying and long-standing and consistent dynamics of these systems, of the relationship, the material relationship between technology and capitalism, something that is not outpaced by the latest startup or the latest headline or the latest piece of discourse. Because, DeepSeek is dominating everything right now. Earlier today, we just recorded a TMK episode talking about DeepSeek, so that'll be coming out this weekend probably, right? Like, you got to do it. You got to talk about it. But one of the things that we talked about in that episode I think is really important here is like understanding like where does something like DeepSeek come from, but also how does it relate to like the more kind of fundamental economics of AI, for example. Like, is it really disrupting the economics of AI in any way that was going to change the trajectory? I mean, the question, we could say, sure, maybe, showing that you can do things like more efficiently, more computationally efficiently, financially efficiently. It doesn't actually require like gold-plated server farms to build a chat bot, but like at the same time, the question there is, what does DeepSeek actually mean in terms of like the political economy of AI, in terms of like, it challenges the economics there, but does it actually solve the business model for generative AI, something that you wrote a really great report on for AI Now recently, right? And I don't think it does, right? Because it's not a fundamentally different technology than GPT-4, right? It's not fundamentally different than Claude. It's the same kind of technology. It was just built by China, and it was built a little bit more cheaply and a little bit more efficiently, and in a different kind of financial landscape by a hedge fund instead of a startup. But like, it doesn't solve the revenue problem for generative AI. It doesn't give us a business model, and so I think if we get captured by the discourse, by the headline, then it becomes easy to get captured by all of the columns from the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal that say DeepSeek changes everything. Because I will not be shocked if in a couple months the only thing DeepSeek changes is now we say ChatGPT, Claude, and DeepSeek, right? When we talk about generative AI, right? Like, it's just one more in the pantheon. And so in writing this book, I really wanted to be able to create more of a framework that understands these relationships, not something that's captured by whatever superficial marketing copy directs our attention at that moment.
Both of you guys have written books now about
When's yours coming?
Write the book. Write the book.
yeah. About Luddism and ways you can think about capitalist technological development. So one thing I'd be curious to hear from both of you, as someone who's skeptical of this sort of criticism, might ask, what is the problem with developing technology within this capitalist system where we're financing private innovation and research and development and deployment? Yes, it may have all these externalities and these social costs. Yeah, it may have some environmental harms. Yeah, it might have some consumer harms. It might have some social inequities. But we're delivering products that improve the material basis and the living standard for people.
We are?
I'm not saying it. I'm saying some people might say it. And we're trying to figure out a way to integrate or develop technologies that can be integrated into harmonizing social relations or solving some political problem or providing housing or food or healthcare in a different way, doing drug discovery, so on and so forth. What is the problem with doing capitalist technological development if it leads to these innovations, even if we don't have a political system that can properly allocate them to people?
So you put Ed in the bay for like a few days, and he's just drinking the Kool-Aid and sandbagging the no.
I got a new job
He's got a startup open for Series A.
I won't say which one it is.
Any angel investors in the crowd? Ed Tech.
No, but I think that's I think that's right, and it speaks to a concept that orients the first part of the book, which is what I call innovation realism, right? Which is riffing on Mark Fisher's capitalist realism, but it's more of a venture capitalist realism. It might be another name for it, right? Which is this idea that like the only way to do innovation, right? The only way to build new technologies, to envision and enact grand, dreams for social progress, to kind of change the material substrate of our lives, right? The only way that you can do that is not just through capitalism, but through a very specific type of financialized capitalism that is venture capital, right? Based on, speculative investments, lots of fictitious value, right? So kind of cashing, a form of check kiting, right? You write a check today and cash it in the hope that the money is in the account in the future. That you can only also build innovation by, embedding it with, guiding it, imprinting it with these logics of kind of like hyper growth, of needing to create returns on that investment, needing to create liquidity events so that people can have their exits and their entrance right? Like, it's a really, really idiosyncratic way of envisioning the development of technology. I mean, an idiosyncratic way of doing it that really only kicked off about 50 years ago. You know, I put a lot of blame on Jimmy Carter because it was during his administration that there were a lot of capital gains tax cuts, that there were rules like regulatory rule changes that allowed pension funds, for example, to start investing in venture capital firms, because before that it was seen as a imprudent investment for pension funds to make. And then there was a rule change that put venture capital in the prudent category, and you see very quickly billions and billions and billions of dollars immediately funneling into venture capital, and that rule change was largely the result of the National Venture Capital Association, the lobbying group for venture capitalists. Because you know, if you are such a unalloyed good for society, you obviously need a lobbying group so you can go around and tell people how good you are. And so this idea here of, you know, everything that you've said, like, sure, you know, there's these externalities, there's these inequities and so on, but look at all the things that we have, look at all the apps that we have, look at the, you know, the $500 billion Stargate projects that we have. You know, isn't this innovation? And the reason they're able to do that, right? The reason they're able to do the yes but, you know, just kind of dismissively yes but away all of the actual harms, all of the actual, you know, I hate to call them externalities because there's nothing external about them, right? They are internal, intrinsic parts of the system and its operations. But you can yes but all those things away if you're the only game in town. You know, and that is the real key here about innovation realism, is you can tell a bunch of lies about how good you are for innovation, how good you are for social progress, because there's no one else around to compete against you in the marketplace of ideas, because you've spent so much time eliminating any kind of like ideological or material ability for alternative ways of building technologies.
Yeah, and I would say that one interesting thing that's happening now is all that sort of you know, construction of myth, or this shared vision that has been promoted as, you know, central to the industry. This you know, this innovation mania, or what used to, you know, 20 years ago be more of at least kind of a shared delusion, it has kind of been winnowing to one that's increasingly only shared by a certain like people of in the industry, a class of people who you know, are able to make these investments, to whom it matters, especially with the scale that we're, you know, seeing these companies default to, right? Like OpenAI is not just like, I'm going to make a chatbot and see what happens. It goes from 0 to 60, trying to attract billions and billions of dollars, $157 billion valuation before it's ever turned to profit.
I gotta correct you now. Yeah. As of today, the Financial Times reports a $300 billion valuation because Masayoshi Son is investing $25 billion.
Oh, congrats.
Aren't you excited?
If anyone's in here from OpenAI, congrats on your enormous company. But I think the counter, I think the other part of that is, with it being so lopsided, with this dream only shared by this elite class of VCs, of startup founders, of tech monopolists, I think it's becoming clearer now to most ordinary people, ordinary consumers, the enormous taxes that these technologies levy on them and the environment and all the other things that you mentioned. It seems now, more than at any point, you know, in my career as a tech journalist, 15 years now, going back, that there is just sort of this intuiting of harm. I mean, there's a reason that, you know, that there's such a okay, I'm getting it. Here we go. I'm supposed to hold it like a medieval knight, like posing for a portrait. Okay. And that's like the limits are really being felt of what the dream can get you, of what this vision, of what this sloganeering can get you if you don't actually deliver something useful. And that's not to say there aren't some use cases for AI that people find interesting or that are genuinely useful, but they are overshadowed by the very real sense that this is a mass automation technology that companies are selling with a pretty specific intent, and that's to automate labor, to slash labor costs, to cut jobs. And that doesn't sit right with people for very good reason, because this is what the companies are saying that they want to do. Sam Altman was just on a podcast saying that, well, given the power of our technology, we're probably going to have to restructure the social contract on my terms, implicitly. And so I think it's just like, I mean, it's just an ideal time to be talking about all of the forces in this book here.
Yeah. I'd say also, especially because it's also a period where I think a lot of people feel powerless and about options ahead of them. But it is also important to remember, that over the decades, there have been different ways people have resisted this sort of technological
Like a knife
domination. Oh, like a knife?
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
right.
The
Oh, they can't? Okay. How's it? Is it good?
I know it doesn't work for C-SPAN, but it actually works for them. So let's do it.
Okay, all right. Okay. We're gonna go against the taxpayers here, and we're gonna I think in the past they were doing some things to the chief executives or to the to the offices.
What kind of things, Ed?
Well, I mean, one of the more successful examples I think of a lot is during the Vietnam War when some activists were trying to stop or interfere with missile defense operations in going on over during the war. They blew up. They evacuated part of it, and then they blew up. Pentagon offices and computers that were involved in it. And I think of that example, and there's a few others from groups that were active in the period, or sabotage that went on in universities and research labs that had access to some of like the earliest computers, where the attempt was to try to articulate to people that they understood how important computation was, and they were going to, in these instances, take hostage some of the, the physical mainframes, or in one way or another get in the way of computation to force that negotiation. I mean, I think at this point people have been like so thoroughly depoliticized, and also these histories have been wiped away that the options feel so remote, right? And also there's been a lot more criminalization of these sorts of activities or tactics. But it is, something to consider, that it's, there's always there are always options in front of us. But I think that people are, as they search for what to do in this moment, just look back to past movements and think about what it is we want. What are the differences today, and what are the things that we want?
Yeah, there's a great section in Palo Alto
Yes.
about this in
Yes.
Malcolm Harris's book about the student activist. I mean, this wasn't that long ago, right? This was a couple generations ago when they, I mean, not only outright sabotage, but occupying data centers on campuses, threatening sabotage. You want to talk about Luddism? Much more militant strains of showing opposition, and I think they were, as you were saying, much more afraid, right, to say this infrastructure, this computational infrastructure, makes the Vietnam War possible. Yeah. Like this is if we shut it down, we can also go some distance towards shutting down.
And I would say most of the computational infrastructure we have today is a lot more vulnerable in some ways, but.
It's all over.
Ed's going to be looking like Bane soon. They expect one of us in the wreckage, brother.
I'll also say, though, that there is also a lot of, just earlier today, I just came from speaking to the California Nurses Union, and there's a lot of people that are activated there. I mean, these are people in the trenches of AI, of deployment. So there's systems that the hospitals are using to where the AI has to give a diagnosis first, and in some cases they can't even override it if it's obviously wrong. So this is causing a lot of pretty grave issues for nurses just to do their daily work, and there is a growing radicalism against it, and willingness to organize against it. Again, it's kind of we saw it with the writers' strike, the recognition, the way that AI or a technology was going to be used to degrade working conditions, to take core parts of their job, and there is this newfound willingness, at least, to stand up to it. And I think that there's, we feel, overwhelmed, and these companies are so immensely capitalized, and it's so tough. But there is just a lot of latent energy and animosity among folks.
I'll pick up on that, and then I think we'll throw it open to the crowd. Kind of pulling together a bunch of the threads that we've been talking about here. Someone's got a show run. What you're saying, what we know is true is that I think also a really core part of like this venture capital mode of technological development is as very supply side driven, right? Like you need to create hype, you need to create excitement, you need to create the sense that this is inescapable, unavoidable, that resistance is futile, right? Because it's a supply side version of innovation, right? And you need to get people to either buy into it or acquiesce to it in some way. We see this happen in various ways. If we think about like the digital platforms, right? A lot of that happened through using Uber, Airbnb, these platforms as ways to do astroturfing, right? To kind of build these astroturf movements to say, hey, you like Airbnb, then you should be calling your local congressperson to say, I don't agree with this regulation or this proposition or whatever, right? It's creating this idea that like you need this service, you love this service, you want to support it, and so. But I think that was in large part very successful as a supply side way of creating kind of consumer support, but also consumer like lock-in to these kinds of services, right? What other option do you have but to use DoorDash or Uber or whatever, right? But I think the thing with AI is we see a supply side drive here, but the demand side is overwhelmingly like, we don't want this, and we don't feel any allegiance to it. We don't see how it actually benefits our lives in any ways. We think that, it's a nice parlor trick, but that's about all it is, right? The Economist was reporting, based on American Census Bureau data, that only 5% of companies right now use AI in any way, and only another 7% think that they might use it in the future, right? And so that's a very low number, and a lot of that numbers, and talking to people who are, I have friends who work for data science and software engineering consultancy, and they, regularly have meetings with CTOs of companies, and they, my friends at this consultancy tell me that these CTOs are like saying, I don't know why we're doing this, but we just feel like we have to, right?
Yeah.
That like
it's that
so
shared delusion.
It's this idea that there's something that sits above you as the chief technology officer at a major Fortune 500 company called the spirit of capital, and it's telling you need AI, and you're like, I don't see how, but it's like, but you need it. And you're like, it's Nosferatu whispering in your ears,
and you
need AI,
and it needs to be big, and it needs to be it's this model. It's so illustrative, I think, that it's just following this Uber model where they just have to conquer the entire market and dominate it, or it's not worth it, or nothing. I mean, just look at how the DeepSeek thing happened, and it's like, oh, actually, we can do AI for 1/50th of the cost, and we can do it without boiling the oceans, and then so there's like this pause where everybody was kind of like watching Sam Altman's Twitter feed to see how he's going to respond, and then just like 6 hours later, he's like, no, we're still doing AGI. Nothing's changed. And it's
in response, Zuckerberg's like, well, we're going to invest $60 billion into AI this year alone, right? And so it is a doubling down because you need it to happen. But I think the important thing here as well, with to tie it back to Luddism, and Luddism comes in a lot of different forms, right? It comes like looking like Bane or Luigi, but it looks like other ways as well. And this is also the idea of winners, technology is legislation. It's also about understanding technology as a political force in our lives, as a thing that sets legislation in the sense that it creates the rules and conditions by which we organize our lives and live our lives in our homes, in our workplaces, in our cities, and so on. But that also means that we're at this inflection point with AI where it doesn't really exist in any serious way. It's a lot of like, I hope one day to use the technology, or we're trying to use Microsoft Copilot in our workflow.
Dumbest it's ever gonna be.
Right, and we're trying, but we're at this inflection point where norms are becoming norms and standards are becoming standards, right? Norms of how we organize our lives, how we do our workflow, right? What kind of tools that we use, right? Those norms are still materializing, they're still solidifying. The standards around how we institutionally and formally do things, right? What tools we use, what systems we use, those are still becoming standards. We're at this really malleable point, which I think also speaks to the way that, the WGA and SAG-AFTRA can say, we don't want that norm to become a norm. We don't want that standard to become a standard, right? How the nurses union is trying to do the same thing, right? How people, this is the point at which these moments of resistance of saying, I don't want to do it that way, or actually if we do it that way, there's no return on investment. It makes the work worse. It creates all these externalities, right? The accounting will never make sense for it, right? Like, it's those forms of not just resistance as a kind of like a blanket resistance or rejection of the technology, but a really clear, motivated, and purposeful criticism of the technology as a way to say, we don't want to do this not because I'm afraid of it, but because it doesn't actually do anything that you say that it does. I think that we're at that point right now where the tech companies, the VCs, they want to preempt it, right? They want to say that the future has already come to be. But it's all of our jobs to say, no, that future is still very much in the making. And, I had an essay come out in Futurism a couple weeks ago talking about AI as like Tinkerbell, right? It only exists if you believe hard enough and clap loud enough for it, right? And right now we have a lot of people telling us, please clap, like Jeb Bush. And in response, we have to look and say, I don't believe in your magic anymore, and just watch how quickly it fades away. Yeah. But maybe we'll throw it open to questions from there.
Yeah.
We can move that one around. I think your mic has had its day, so you might want to. We might just use that, and then I'll. So I've got a question right back here. You'll give me a sec to get to you. There you go.
Well, did not expect to go first. So you mentioned a lot of people are beginning to experience this technology in their daily lives. You mentioned people like Luigi who are Luddish, but also deeply sort of eclectic in their political philosophy. What do you think is like the potentials or the pitfalls of like a red-brown alliance to defeat technology? And how would the Luddites have experienced that back in their day with their politics?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? Because, and I think this is also, there's always the possibility, of like, you have the Unabomber joining hands with, whoever, right? And like, but there's politics can make for strange bedfellows in a lot of ways. Luddism is no anomaly or no exception to this at all, right? But I think for for both me and Brian and Ed, right, that like I think for us it's also about understanding and placing Luddism in that in its historical context and in its political economic context, right? So not just seeing Luddism as, you know, anybody rejecting technology is a Luddite in some way, right? Like, yeah, I think it's really easy to do that if our understanding of what Luddism means is a very like basic one that is just kind of like technophobia or primitivism. But instead, I think a lot of our work is really actually based in providing a much more grounded understanding and a much more theoretical kind of understanding of Luddism as a specific way of orienting yourself towards not just technology, but technology in its context, right? Technology in its economic and political and social context. Understanding, you know, that it really is about it is not about a critique of technology as such. It is about a critique that understands technology as a vector of social power, right? And seeing how is this technology being created or wielded in some way as a way to materialize someone else's social power over your life or in your life in some way, right? So and so I think that analysis then has to take seriously that question of social power, those questions of the political economy, right? That relationship between social power and financial value, and it, you know, from there, right? You can then have all kinds of you can take that in all kinds of different ways. But I think if we really keep our focus on that relationship between social power and financial value, who has it, who wields it, how is technology used as a kind of stand-in for those relationships, a way to both enact and extend, but also distract us from those relationships. That, to me, at least I think, puts us on a much stronger grounding for a more a Luddism that goes beyond a red-brown alliance.
Yeah, I'll just add that it's, I think, important to note that like Luddism historically like is not reactionary. It is a movement that developed eventually out of necessity, but after a long tradition of worker organizing, going through the, quote, correct channels, petitioning parliament, building power in a more traditional sense. Labor organizing was technically illegal at the time that the Luddites were attempting to do so, so that structure wasn't available to them. But, you know, as Jathan has articulated, it's important to underline that it was very strategic what they were trying to do. They were targeting certain factory owners, certain abusive factory owners, and striking the machinery was both kind of a way to signal, you know, a particular kind of labor strike, as well as, you know, carrying symbolic value. So it was very strategic, right? They're breaking the machines that are automating jobs and tearing up the social contract in a very specific way. They would often just smash the machines that were automating jobs in a certain way or were operated by children, and they would leave the other machines that a factory had that had been employed for a long time in place, because it really was a much more organized and tactical movement. And I think it's best understood, although not limited to, as primarily a labor movement as well. So I think, you know, at least historically, it's important to note that. All right.
Well, yeah, just also real quick, yeah, I feel like there's no room for a red-brown alliance also, to emphasize that. I mean, even if we were aimed at the same target, they are interested in something diametrically opposed to what any leftist, socialist, communist would be interested in, right? I mean, you think of Peter Thiel, right, as a, you know, probably one of the more prominent examples of what the, you know, reactionaries who are interested in using tech or interested in building some sort of alternative tech order are doing, right? I mean, Peter Thiel is part of a group and a coalition of people who are interested in rolling back the threadbare, like, reforms and crawl towards some measure of civilizing how barbaric the civilization is, right? And the idea that we should partner with people who want to re-legitimize caste, with people who want to bring skull measuring and phrenology and pseudo-racial science to the front of politics. You want to, you know, figure out ways to make permanent, you know, terror and spectacle violence and remote control and discipline and pervasive surveillance, because they don't like the same sort of capitalists that we do is nuts. You know, there's almost no there's no situation where I think a red-brown alliance makes any sort of sense, and we should always like keep that in our minds, even if, you know, one of them is particularly charismatic or convincing or writes a nice manifesto for some fucking venture capital fund or whatever. You know.
Got a question over here.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you all. It was a really fun conversation. Hi, Brian. You know, Jathan, I loved your book, by the way. You read my blog post about your book already. I'm Chris Carlson. Nowtopians.com if anybody wants to read that. You brought up the idea about work, which I always consider really this discussion about technology gets a little bit fetishistic around technology, because finally, what is technology but a subset of the decisions we make about how we produce life? And there's a lot of different questions of technologies, from cars to bicycles to, you know, which kind of machines we want to communicate with, to which ways we want to produce food, how we want to do water. All of these things are part of the question. So getting a little bit over fixated on AI makes me uncomfortable. But you know, when you bring up the idea, you mentioned, you know, how do we work and what do we do? But the missing question was why? And that's the question I put to everybody in the audience always, is why do we do what we do? The vast majority of the work we do as a human society is a fucking waste of time, and it should stop tomorrow. I mean, from banking, insurance, real estate, advertising, military production, the production of shoddy goods that are just, you know, fall apart in 6 months. Who decided to do it like that? And why? Why do we get up in the morning and do that? We could get up in the morning and do something quite different. We don't even have the conversation. Like, I'm a nutcase for just saying that, right? So that's part of what I think is really kind of should be deep into this conversation about technology, and the role of the mechanic and the Luddite is a crucial part of that, because a big part of what we see is when people aren't at their idiotic jobs trying to make money to pay their idiotic rent, what are they doing? They're working. And oftentimes what they're working at is they're appropriating the technology, the technosphere that we find ourselves subsumed in, to create different ways of using it, to actually address the anomie of modern life, to address the ecological crisis, et cetera, et cetera. So that's my rant part of it. And my question to you make a very interesting argument in your book, which I really liked, and I'm not sure what to do with it, because I'm reminded of my life, which I came of age at the dawn of neoliberalism, really in 1979, 1980s, when I really started sinking my teeth into these things, and we started Processed World back then. And you know, we didn't know what we were up against. We kind of knew what we were living through, but we didn't fully grasp it theoretically at all. And you mentioned this interesting idea that data is value, which is a kind of a deep Marxist concept. But I just wanted to sort of juxtapose that to Varoufakis's argument in his techno-feudalism book that capitalism's over. Value creation's over. It's all rentierism now, which seems wrong. And then I just heard Chris Hayes yesterday, not a person I would normally want to quote or refer to, but you know, he has an argument in which he's quoting Marx's philosophical manuscripts from 1844 and saying that wage labor was the thing that was captured by capital all these years. Now they're trying to capture attention. So there's this way that I think different people with some version of a Marxist framework are trying to get a hold of what the hell's going on. And I think you have your own version, and maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, just real quick. This is Chris Carlson, great longtime Bay Area historian, activist. We're delighted that a fourth Luddite has descended from what a treat.
Is that Chris Carlson's music I hear? No, very, very good. Yes. So the question of why do we work, I think, has most recently, at least to my mind, been best answered by the book's Mute Compulsion by Soren Mao, right? Like, you know, I can't say enough good things about that book. It's so fascinating, but because it speaks to this idea, right, that the market, you know, it is, again, one of these like constructs that we're entombed within, right? That we live within, and that, you know, you don't need the force of a gun or of ideology to convince you to go to work every morning. You just need your own social reproductive needs, to be like, well, I have to get up and go to work every morning so that I can feed myself, care for my family, and pay rent, right? And that's the mute compulsion of the market. And I think that, you know, tying that into technology, I mean, this is a way in which capitalism has been really adept at using specific kinds of technology as a way of, you know, saying these are the kinds of activities that you must do because this is what value production is like. You know, this is where value production happens. You know, we talk about data. And yeah, so in my book, you know, I talk about data as capital. And I think that there's been because it's data as capital in the sense that it's an essential and fundamental resource for capitalism to accumulate, to circulate. It powers the systems, but it also becomes the reason for existence of systems, right? What are the digital technologies we're talking about? What are AI, but both the products of data, but also systems created by that data, systems created to collect that data, to valorize that data, right? And so if we think about, though, the role of data here, it then becomes what's our role in that system? It's, you know, often it's something to do with data, right? We're producing that data, we're being governed by that data. But there's also the kind of, you know, if we think about a Marxist analysis of capital, it's also always based in understanding and trying to analyze these core contradictions within capital, and how capitalism is always kind of trying to reconcile these contradictions, right? And so, you know, I think there's like two contradictions that we can talk about if we think about the relationship between, labor and capital, and how data might intermediate some of those relationships, right? So in the book, and you know, I want to give a big shout out as well to some really great work that Kelly Pendergrass in the audience here has done on cheap data. And you know, thinking about this contradiction of the value of data as both fundamentally necessary for the systems, but also being cheapened by the systems. And this also, you know, is a connection that we can and should make. And Kelly's written a great essay that makes this connection as well, between, you know, the work that like Jason Moore and Raj Patel have done on the kind of the cheap things, right? Understanding the development and history of capitalism as a process of cheapening the things that capital needs to perpetuate itself. So things like nature, labor, life, you know, work, care, these kinds of money, right? These things are cheapened as soon as they're thrown into the engine of the market. As soon as they are assetized, treated as speculative objects, as soon as they are burned as capital in the machinery, they become cheapened. But capital needs it, right? And so I think we see this happening right now with, on one hand, you know, the way that data has become cheapened because it's been exhausted by systems like, you know, OpenAI. The creation of these large language models is about exhausting data, you know, which is often the, you know, product of people, right? So not labor itself, but the product of people's labor in some way. But you want to cheapen that data by trying to disentangle it from that relationship that it has with people, right? So you have things like synthetic data, right? Data created by AI. And this speaks to another core contradiction that I talk about in the book. I call it the perpetual value machine, right? Which is this, I think what motivates the creation of technologies, I mean, for the last, you know, 300 years under capitalism, and AI is perhaps the latest and greatest attempt at cracking this nut, which is how do you perpetually create value and capture surplus value without people there to create that surplus value, right? And this is that, you know, in other words, how can capital get what it wants, which is value, without having to rely on the thing that it hates, which is labor, you know? And so far, it hasn't been able to figure out that system. And AI, but that's the thing, it mistakes a relationship between people using tools to create value as the same thing as tools creating value without people, right? And there's a contradiction here. There's a conflation of two things that are not anything nearly alike. And a lot of the rhetoric, a lot of the investment, a lot of the visions around AI is based on that conflation of how do we cheapen data and cheapen labor as a way to capture more and more value. It's a nut that can never be cracked, right? Because it's premised on contradictory axioms. But again, we have to get up every morning to work at our stupid jobs to pay our stupid rent because capital knows that it needs us to create that labor. It hates that it needs us to create that value. And it tries to create systems to eliminate their reliance on us to create that value, but it will never do so. So instead, the second best option is create systems that chain people to their stupid jobs and their stupid rent until they can finally crack a nut that can't be cracked.
So we have some stuff from online, but I'd like to throw something into this. So what is a useful methodology, a useful approach? And if we're talking resistance, what are the different forms it can take?
I mean, I think resistance takes a lot of forms for sure. So, podcasting. I mean, it's the only true form of Samsudot left, right? It's the it's the hammer that will take down the administration. That's why I heard Trump's going to outlaw podcasting soon. No. Look, I think resistance takes a number of forms. I mean, it is the things that we've talked about, right? There is a very long history. Brian's book is that history of real kind of material, physical, and social organizing ways of resisting these technologies. And, we live in a different time than the Luddites did in a lot of ways, which in a different time where, it's not as if the Luddites had it easy either, right? Like, they made machine breaking or frame breaking a treasonous affair punishable by hanging, right? And, I think go pick up a hammer and try to smash a data center or a server farm, and you'll probably come across that treasonous affair punishable by hanging in a somewhat modern sense. But, it's and we should say as well that in a lot of ways the Luddites failed, right? Like they failed because in the sense that they did not stop the march of industrial capital or the accumulation of capital by exploitative and bosses and or the march of the factory system. They failed in a discursive way as well, that now we have to sit here 200 years later trying to be like, no, the Luddites were right, and they're we should not drag their name through the mud. It doesn't mean what Mark Andreessen says it means, right? It means this thing. And so, but I think I say that as a way to say that, like, I think the lessons of Luddism is not a do what the Luddites did in a literal historical sense. The lessons of Luddism is how can we take inspiration from that ruthless criticism, from a ruthless criticism that was based on following that criticism to its logical conclusions, right? Which was that if we understand how the technology works and we understand the context in which it is created and used, and we have and we see that it is done so in a way that does not provide any social benefit, but actually accumulates mass amounts of harm for most people while funneling a lot of wealth and power towards a small number of people. If our conclusions are such, and then we go through every step that we can, right? We try to negotiate, we try to petition, we try to have peaceful organizing and marching, right? For the Luddites, one of the reasons why I think they're archetypes of a ruthless criticism is because, like Mark said, not shirking from our conclusions or from the powers that be, they took that ruthless criticism to its logical conclusion and said, well, the only thing that's left to us, the only option that's left to us is to pick up a hammer and smash the machine under the cover of night, right? And I think the lesson to take there is, one, have we even exhausted all of the options available to us before we get to the pick up a hammer under the cover of night, contingency? I think the answer is no, right? Like, we haven't exhausted all those options of organizing, of resisting, and like, you know, in terms of like through the unions, making technology a labor issue again, right? An issue that should be taken up by unions, through social movements, through social groups, right? Of petitioning our representatives, our politicians, right? Of, you know, whatever it is, right? All of these things, all these steps that the Luddites exhausted before getting to the pick up a hammer stage are ones that we have not even begun to exhaust yet, right? We're still at the analysis phase a lot of ways, right? Which is what we're doing right now, which is we're still at the we should be galvanized against this thing phase. The Luddites were they moved long past that pretty quickly because they felt the material effects of those technologies on their lives. They didn't need my book or your book to tell them, hey, these things are maybe not so good as we've been told by the bosses, right? They knew it in a very intimate way. I think and it's speaking to, you know, all of the pushback against AI right now. To me, as exciting as that is, it's still step one, right? It's that this is a thing that we should be galvanized against. We shouldn't just buy into the bullshit. We should reject the bullshit and then push further and say, wait a minute, why is there so much bullshit, right? And so I think that is to say, we haven't come anywhere near exhausting all of our options for resistance. We're still at the beginning, and I hope this is only upward from here.
So I got a question from online. What provoked or inspired you to take a character archetype-based approach in the book? Who, what else are important role models in technological capitalism, both in the positive sense, like in the mechanic, in the Luddite, and in the negative sense, like the futurist?
Yeah, so, and maybe this is our last question. So we're right at 8 o'clock, which is great. I want to have lots of time to sign books and talk to people. So I'll answer that. I think it's great. Like, why organize the book along these ways of a kind of an archetype approach, or, you know, that kind of motivation, right? And so for me, I think it really was about trying to understand these different sides of the kinds of the kind of analysis I wanted to present, right? And bring together these, you know, in a lot of ways, like bring together, you know, technology and capitalism through, okay, what archetypes can kind of bring together that relationship, can kind of represent some a kind of a middle point between understanding this relationship. And you know, I think honestly it came out of the writing. It wasn't necessarily a something I set off. Yeah, I had the title and then it was like, great, I'll write the book from that. It was much more of I'm trying to write about what I think a materialist analysis means, what that looks like, how we should do it, and I'm prone to talk about the mechanics of things, right? Like, you know, trying to really understand like the operations of machinery. I mean, I am also, you know, I'm a social scientist by training, but I you know, am an academic in an information technology school, and so my life itself kind of is constantly being confronted with the technologies and people who are building these things, talking to people who are building them, interested in grounding any analysis I do on a real deep and crystal clear understanding of what the thing is and how it's built and what it can actually do. So I'm not just relying on what people tell me it is in marketing copy or something like that, right? And so for me, I'm prone to talk about it in terms of the mechanics of the system. And then, of course, I've been writing about the Luddites favorably for a very long time. So I was like, I want to bring that very explicitly into the book. And so the mechanic and the Luddite just really came about organically here. It's like really representing these archetypes for what a socio-technical a material analysis looks like. In terms of, I guess I'll just leave off, you know, talking about, you know, the question asked alluded to the futurist, and that's because the last chapter of the book, which is focused on futures, opposes the futurist as the kind of like antithesis of the mechanic and the Luddite, right? A form of understanding technology that is based in the immaterial statements about technology, things about, things that are not grounded in reality or grounded in kind of these underlying political, economic, social relationships, but are instead grounded in visions and statements and hype and dreams and so on, right? Things that are ungrounded, things that are kind of sandcastles in the sky. And so I kind of counterpose the futurist as an archetype for an immaterial understanding of technology and capitalism as a way to then provide that foil at the very end of the book for what we're pushing against, what we should be steering away from in our analysis. But maybe I'll leave things there.
Yeah.